Pricing controversies surrounded Nvidia's RTX 40 series launch, amplified by the fact that the firm released a genuinely great product in the form of the RTX 3080 at a $699 MSRP. RTX 4070 similar but a bit slower at $600. 4070 Ti undeniably faster but priced at $800. Nvidia aims to address the 3080 situation once and for all with its super refresh, and some might argue that what we're getting here is the products that we possibly should have had a year ago. 4070 Super then, priced at $600 US, £580, the launch price of the RTX 4070. It's essentially the same card as its predecessor with two notable improvements. Firstly, CUDA-core count is significantly increased, 7,168 cores versus 5,888, meaning a nigh on 22% improvement. And to push performance on still further, there's a 10% increase in TGP, so essentially more juice to get more from the AD104 processor. And as it is AD104 in place, there's unfortunately no chance of a wider memory interface, meaning we're still on a 192-bit bus with 504 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. The bus also limiting the card to the same 12 gigs of GDDR6X memory. So what we should be hoping for is a good-sized performance lift to the standard RTX 4070, perhaps knocking on the door of RTX 4070 Ti performance. Meanwhile, the vanilla 4070 gets a $50 price cut, with Nvidia heavily hinting that third-party partners can reduce that still further to more meaningfully compete with AMD's impressive RX 7800 XT. So for review today, we have the Founders Edition version of the 4070 Super. Made by Nvidia itself, I consider the vanilla 4070 FE to be the definitive version of that particular card. Beautifully built, but not horrendously over-engineered in the way that partner cards tend to be. 4070 Super FE is similarly delightful for all the same reasons, but this time Nvidia adds a little further spice with a Spinal Tap style none more black color swap. It attracts fingerprints something rotten, but it's genuinely a great looking product. And bearing in mind that you're getting sort of 3080 Ti, 3090-ish performance in a traditionally sized GPU with excellent energy efficiency, this is just as much of a winner as the RTX 4070 was when we first looked at that. There's a lot of familiarity elsewhere too in terms of efficiency. I mean, we all know how efficient the 40 series cards are at this point, and I don't think we need to dwell too much on the numbers. But we did run them. As usual, we benchmark a game for performance and for average power consumption. Divide watts by frame rate and you get joules per frame. The lower the better. Looking at control here, full RT, 4070 Super just as efficient as the 4070, using 69% of the power of the RX 7800 XT. Yeah, a bit tricky to choose a comparison point from AMD at this price point, but the 7800 XT still has much to commend it. Forza Horizon 5 in raster seemed to show a touch more efficiency for the 4070 Super over the 4070, but this may well be a rounding error, to be honest. And yeah, circa 68% of the power consumption of 7800 XT. Forza does kind of favour Nvidia though, in contrast to Hitman 3, which is a champion on AMD cards. And here, because of that performance advantage, the efficiency comes across much the same across the board. So far, so Ada. So let's move on to some gaming benchmarks. I'm not going to dwell a huge amount on the case-by-case numbers because fundamentally this is pretty much a rerun of the last time Nvidia put out its supers. RTX 4070 Super is significantly faster than the 4070, closer to 4070 Ti performance, but not quite there. Like typically, I'd say 89 to 95% of its performance. Presumably a move to not totally annoy recent buyers of 4070 Ti's. Dying Light 2, 1440p resolution, no upscaling. Full RT here. There's a 19 percentage point boost for the Super over the non-Super, while the 4070 Ti is still about 11% faster. RX 7800 XT roundly beaten. The new Super is 40% faster. If we swap out the 7800 XT for the RTX 3080, yeah, it's about 15 to 16 points to the better overall. So sort of, 3080 Ti, 3090 style performance there. Cyberpunk 2077, again under RT, no upscaling, immensely more performant on Nvidia hardware, which kind of makes sense, bearing in mind Nvidia's very close association with CD Projekt Red on this one. 4070 Super, 67 percentage points ahead of AMD here. Pretty staggering, really. Meanwhile, an 18-point uplift over the standard 4070, and you're getting circa 92 to 93% of the 4070 Ti's performance. There's a 13-point lead over the RTX 3080, which, again, takes us into that 3080 Ti, 3090 territory, I guess. I could go on, and to be honest, I will, let's face facts, but suffice it to say, all the scores and resolutions are in my review on Eurogamer, with all of the bar charts you'll need. But before we move on from RT, here's a look at Control. It's a game I bring up because outside of RTX 4090, it's a title that performs disproportionately under par on Ada Lovelace cards. Here the RTX 4070 Super is 14 points to the better against the non-Super, trending slightly below the average then, but conversely you're getting like 93-94% of 4070 Ti frame rates. Thing is, compared to RX 7800 XT and the circa 40-point lead we generally get reduces to 31%. Meanwhile, the Super only beats the 3080 by just 4 points. So yeah, 3080 Ti, 3090, those will be more performant on this one. Moving on to rasterization, and 7800 XT properly arrives and makes itself known. Overall, it's not quite as fast, but at the same time it's both cheaper and has more VRAM, of course. For Hitman 3, I'm going to move to 4K for this one to rule out the CPU completely. 4070 Super trades blows with the 7800 XT across the benchmark and actually emerges at the end 5 percentage points to the better. Meanwhile, the Super's only 7 points ahead of RTX 3080. In Ada terms, I see a 15-point lead for the Super over the non-Super. You're getting around 89% of the 4070 Ti's performance. I can see why the Super can't be as fast as the Ti, but I do think Nvidia could have done a little bit better. The Super beats RX 7800 XT in A Plague Tale Requiem, but only by around 4 percentage points, again reminding us that AMD is really good at rasterization in this area of the market. Even against RTX 3080. 7-point advantage to the Super, bit lackluster. We're in familiar territory with the other Ada 70 series cards. 17% lead over RTX 4070 and around 91% of Ti throughput. So to reiterate then, more games, more benchmarks, more comparisons, they're all in the Eurogamer review I put together. But that's the spread really in terms of performance differentials. I also spent some time looking at the RTX 4070 Super more holistically, outside of standard benchmarks, which I think do a pretty poor job of taking into account stuff like, DLSS or other features. And yes, there are use cases at looking at things other than ultra settings. Let's consider the AAA space at the moment, for example. The primary target platform for developers seems to be PlayStation 5. That means that visual targets are defined by the capabilities of that machine. Developers are primed to ensure that game engines and performance are finely balanced for a good experience on that machine. And yeah, it's where we often find matches with our own optimized settings. It's no coincidence there. So I did some experiments with a number of games, kicking off with Cyberpunk 2077. We talked about this benchmark run in a recent video where I was able to transfer across CD Projekt Red's internal streaming tests from PC to console. First test, well, here we are looking at performance mode on the PlayStation 5. This uses dynamic resolution scaling, and we can reasonably assume that when the game can't hit 60 frames per second on the console, it's at minimum dynamic res, in this case 1008p, upscaled to 1800p by FSR2. Attach the exact same settings to PC, and you have effectively twice the performance. Of course, you're more likely to use DLSS, or even DLSS 3 frame generation, and you can see the corresponding runs there. Obviously at this point PC hardware is on a whole different level, even in like-for-like comparisons. Phantom Liberty is heavier, and I was also keen to see how PC compared on match settings in an area where PS5 consistently failed to meet its performance target. 2160p output here, FSR2 quality mode. And here's how that worked out. In matched settings, 4070 Super offered a 2.21 times performance multiplier, rising to 2.3x when FSR2 quality mode was swapped out for its DLSS equivalent. That rises to 3.2x in frame rate terms when DLSS 3 frame generation kicks in. But remember, in that scenario you are trading latency for more fluidity. Console comparisons are fine, but check out straight RT Overdrive performance here on 4070 Super. Now this is a world apart from the console experience, but it works well on this hardware. Again, I'm upscaling to 1800p on the left there, then using the GPU scaler to output to 2160p. DLSS performance mode, and we're in the mid 70s across all of my test clips. Base frame rates are in the 40s, so with the extra latency you will feel a difference, but it works okay, especially on a gamepad. On the right, we've upped the DLSS quality level to be on the balanced mode and dropped to a 1440p output resolution. I'll be doing that in a lot of my tests here because while I consider this class of card as fine for 4K gaming, many, possibly a lot more, end users will be playing at 1440p instead. And here we're mostly in 100 frames per second territory. The classic trouble spot, the cherry blossom marketplace, shows things at their worst in the base Cyberpunk 2077. Still, the point is that while this is a mid-range card, you do have an entry point to higher end experiences here, things that are simply just not possible whatsoever on a console. And that extends to Alan Wake 2, same deal really in our testing. We know the exact quality settings of the PS5's quality mode, which is capped at 30 FPS. Now, it's hard to find drops to that cap since it was patched, but here's an example I did find. A 2.17 times performance increase in matched settings on the RTX 4070 Super, rising to 2.31x when FSR2 balanced mode is swapped out with its DLSS equivalent. And yes, it's another DLSS 3 game, meaning a 3.1x frame rate increase over PlayStation 5. In effect, 4070 Super offers over twice the performance of the PS5 in these games, while DLSS increases both quality and frame rate. Frame generation, again, you're trading latency for increased fluidity. Path tracing at high resolutions on 4070 Super, it is viable and it looks astonishing, but make no mistake, this is super taxing stuff. I'm using console equivalent quality settings there, but then I'm adding Alex's optimized path tracing settings. This is a taxing area, but with frame generation active, we're in the mid 70s when using DLSS performance mode to upscale to 1800p, rising to around 90 FPS on average, dropping to 1440p with DLSS balance mode. Bit of a tricky one to assess because while both resolutions are totally viable and look excellent, base frame rates in the 1800p mode can dip to circa 30 FPS at worst, and with frame gen in play, 100 milliseconds of lag is observable in the stress points. 1440p will feel better, but ultimately 100 milliseconds may not be great, but latency is kind of relative. According to Tom Morgan's latest testing for the PS5 cloud surface, local lag from the console on PlayStation 5 in Cyberpunk's performance mode, which runs at 60 frames per second, is, you guessed it, 100 milliseconds. Haven't really seen too many complaints about that. Maybe it is just a joypad thing. It is an inherently laggier device. But wait, just a second here. We've just talked about two of the top 3 best game graphics of 2023, so why not circle back and take a look at our overall winner? That'll be Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora. I'm on high settings here, which is essentially the same as the PlayStation 5's 30 FPS quality mode, but there have been a couple of settings tweaks upwards for PC's high. This game is monstrously performant on PC, in my opinion, and without FSR3 frame generation active here, we're getting exceptional results. 4K performance across this clip averages to 76 frames per second with DLSS balanced mode, rising to 90 FPS at 1440p in DLSS quality mode. An astonishingly good-looking game with overhead to spare in cranking up settings still further. PlayStation 5 comparisons aren't easy to do owing to dynamic resolution scaling and 30 FPS caps, but we're easily 2x faster here. Let's talk Unreal Engine 5 now, and this one is kind of controversial, right? Because generally speaking, these games are heavy. That's what stuff like Lumen, Nanite and Virtual Shadow Maps means. Next-gen fidelity comes at a cost, and we were warned about this. Going back to the Matrix Awakens demo, you can see that the engine was built with upscaling in mind. Epic literally advertising the fact in the code here by showing its own TSR technology in action alongside all of its other innovations. Not bad, TSR is pretty good, but DLSS is better. And let's kick off by looking at Fortnite Unreal Engine 5, a 60 FPS experience on PS5 with dynamic resolution scaling in place and TSR upscaling. I've matched settings here, effectively a mixture of high and epic, but I've swapped in DLSS and stuck to performance upscaling at 4K and balanced upscaling at 1440p. Averaged across the replay here, 4K outputs delivering 112 frames per second, rising to a remarkable 152 frames per second at 1440p. So VRR working in combination with a 4K 120 or a 1440p 144Hz screen is going to look pretty good. I also wanted to check out Immortals of Aveum, here running fully maxed out, again with 4K in DLSS performance mode, 1440p at DLSS balanced. So the reason I chose this one is that PS5 kind of struggles here in terms of upscaling quality and in locking to its target 60 frames per second. 4070 Super just blasts through the game. The real-time 3D intro to the third chapter is very taxing on the GPU, more so than most gameplay, so I thought I'd bench it. Frame rate in this sequence, 73 FPS average at 4K DLSS performance mode, rising to 95 frames per second if you engage frame gen on top of that. 1440p in DLSS balanced sees a 99 FPS average, rising to a remarkable 145 FPS with frame gen added. So we've seen a lot of comments about upscaling being used as a crutch, but the point is that it's equally viable as an enabler of new technologies. Unreal Engine 5 would not have rolled out without it. You can take a view on frame generation and its positives and negatives, but upscaling is here to stay. If you want to see upscaling as a crutch, check out The Last of Us Part 1. We've got a pretty much 100% lock on console equivalent settings here, and we're stacking up the RTX 4070 Super against the PlayStation 5 in its fidelity mode with a 40 FPS cap for 120Hz TVs. We can actually find the limits of the engine and stack up those scenes against the PC. Something's clearly up with this port still. I measured just a 36% uplift to performance at native 4K against the console. And yeah, basically at this point it does require DLSS quality mode to get you within sniffing distance of the 2x performance multiplier we've taken for granted thus far. Going to end with A Plague Tale Requiem, and similar to The Last of Us, we could use the PlayStation 5's fidelity mode in a 120Hz container to find areas where the game can't sustain its target 40 FPS cap. In match settings, using Asobo's upscaler with a 2160p output from a 1440p input, there's a 1.96 times like-for-like increase, moving from PS5 to 4070 Super, very similar when it comes to the results offered up by the DLSS quality mode. Frame generation is available in this game too, and our test scene offered up a 2.5x increase in frame rate over the console. That's closer to what we'd expect a $600 GPU to be really. Doubling console performance really is a baseline, but as I hope you can see from my various testing here, once you start factoring in things like path tracing, ray reconstruction, DLSS upscaling, the experience becomes greater than the sum of its parts. While frame generation is a very useful tool when high refresh rate monitors are so prevalent in the PC space. So in summary then, the first Super arrival increases value, and like the 2019 20 series refresh, comes across as the sort of pricing that we should have had at launch. In terms of competition, AMD's RX 7800 XT continues to possess more memory, holds up extremely well in rasterization, and obviously costs a whole lot less, to the point where cutting prices on the non-Super RTX 4070 to match it dollar for dollar would have been a good idea. However, in terms of features and overall performance, I do think the 4070 Super is the one to have, even if there is the sense that closer parity with 4070 Ti could have put the value arguments to bed once and for all. Bottom line though, outside of the benchmarks and when I actually sat down and started to play games with it, I found this card to be a good match for my 48-inch 4K LG OLED and good value overall. Okay, so that's the end of the video then. Like, subscribe, share on the off chance that you did like it and did find it useful, and yeah, ring the bell for things that may well take the form of notifications that may arrive in some kind of short-term timescale. No guarantees there. DF supporter program though, join us for early access, the ability to contribute to DF Direct Weekly, early access to DF Direct Weekly, high quality video downloads, bonus materials and a whole lot more. Honestly, we couldn't do it without you. Your support is crucial. Oh, and just a little reminder here for store.digitalfoundry.net, where you shall find a range of appealing merchandise. But that's all from me on this one. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.